Story time about how my lying, cheating husband moved his mistress into our home. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My husband is a classic narcissist. He's a total love bomber, lies, and gaslights. We met through some friends at a party, and the day that we met, he totally love bombed me. He told me I was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, that he wanted to marry me, and that we should have kids. Unfortunately, I believed everything he said. On our second day, he told me that he loved me. And when I didn't tell him that I loved him back, he got really upset and told me that we shouldn't see each other anymore. A few weeks passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about him, so I reached out. Worst mistake of my life. At the time, I didn't realize how wealthy he was. But boy, did he start letting me know. He would flaunt that he was super rich and even invited me on a trip, which he paid for. We ended up going to the Bahamas and it was magical. Of course, I started falling in love with him. The last day of the trip, he actually asked me to marry him and I said yes. My whole family thought it was absolutely crazy of me because I only knew him for about 2 weeks. When we got back home, I moved into his beautiful house. You see, I was in a really bad situation. I had a part-time job, no savings, and basically no future. At least that's what he said. So when I moved in, he insisted that I quit my job and basically tend to the house, which I did. So I had no money of my own. This was around the time that he would start gaslighting me. Whenever we got into fights, he would call me names and just threaten me. And when I would bring it up later on, he would totally deny that he ever said anything like that. When we started planning the wedding, things calmed down. He was always at work and I was always at home. We finally got married and went on our honeymoon to Italy. And that's when he started changing even more. He would shame me whenever I tried to post a cute picture of myself on Instagram. And he basically convinced me that I was trying to get attention from other guys, so I stopped posting. Our third night in Italy, he got drunk and we got into a really big fight. I decided to leave the hotel, but when I came back a few hours later, he had a random girl in his room and told me to leave. I couldn't believe his behavior. After about 20 minutes, he let me back into the room and told the girl to leave. That's when I told him I was going to go back home and that I made a huge mistake by marrying him. He apologized and started crying. He said nothing happened to her and part of me just wanted to believe him so desperately, so I did. When we got back home, he was on his best behavior. Until one day he told me he wanted to hire a live-in cleaning lady. Little did I know it was his mistress. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my husband moved his mistress into our home. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My narcissist of a husband told me he wanted to hire a cleaning lady. A live-in cleaning lady. A few days later, he shows up with this woman who clearly did not look like a cleaning lady. When I told him I did not want her living in our home, he told me that I had to do what he said because he was the breadwinner. Mind you, he told me to quit my job, so I did. That's when he told me that somebody needed to clean the house, cook for him, and basically take care of him. In other words, I wasn't doing that. Which isn't true because I made him dinners every single day and cleaned the entire house. I told him I knew she wasn't a cleaning lady and that he needed to kick her out. He got really angry and slammed the door. A few minutes later, I hear him coming up the stairs with her. He shows her to the guest room and tells her to settle in. Then he came back into the room, told me that I had to deal with it and that this is how things were going to be from now on. By the way, this girl is Russian, and my husband told me that she did not speak English. So basically, I had no way to communicate with her. But my husband did speak Russian, isn't that convenient? So, every single day, this girl would pretend to wash dishes, pretend to clean his clothes, pretend to make the bed. Oh yeah, and she would only wash his dishes, not mine. The situation was way too much for me, so I told my husband I was going to go stay with my sister. That's when he threatened me and told me that if I left, I might not be able to come back. So of course, I packed my things and went straight to my sister's house. The very next day, my husband shows up to my sister's house with divorce papers. He told me I needed to sign them because he fell in love with the cleaning lady. I told him I wouldn't sign them and he left. Then my sister called the police and told them that my husband had a woman captive in his house and that she was probably in the country illegally. And guess what, y'all? She was. The cops actually took her from the house and now he's asking me to move back in. He took the whole divorce back and wants to take me on a trip. My sister thinks I should get back with him just to make his life miserable. The problem is I have no money of my own. And to be honest, part of me still loves him. I really need some advice and perspective from someone who's not me. Story time about how I exposed my abusive, toxic boyfriend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My boyfriend is and has always been very charming. He has a ton of friends and everyone loves him. He's a very good-looking guy and girls are always chasing him. I met him 2 years ago at a party. I had heard a bunch of stuff about him. I heard that he was a player and that he cheated on all of his girlfriends. So when he came up to me at the party, I was really cold. I basically told him I didn't want to talk to him and that I would never give him my number. And unfortunately, this made him try even harder. He could never take no for an answer. He spent an hour trying to convince me to go to have breakfast with him the next day. He was so charming and so good looking, of course I eventually said yes. Even a few of his guy friends at the party told me not to go. But of course, I ended up going with him to breakfast the next day. We hung out a few times and then he told me that he liked that I wasn't easy. He told me that I was different from other girls and he asked me to be his girlfriend. I said yes because I was starting to catch feelings. One night we went out with his friends and he started calling me stupid in front of them. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how I exposed my abusive, toxic boyfriend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So we went out with his friends one night and he started calling me stupid in front of them. He had never done this before and I was really surprised. I thought maybe he was just doing it to impress his guy friends. That's when I asked him straight up in front of his friends why he kept calling me stupid. One of his friends steps up and says, yeah, why do you keep calling her stupid? He stayed quiet for a second and didn't know what to say. Then he just laughed it off and said, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was doing that. That's when his friends started asking me questions about myself. I told him I was studying to be an engineer and that I had graduated with top honors. Well, let's just say they were all super impressed. We finally got into his car and he was driving me home. I was upset at him, so I decided not to give him a kiss goodnight. I started getting out of the car and he grabbed my wrist really hard. He pulled me back into the car and forcefully kissed me. He said that I embarrassed him in front of his friends, but that he'd give me a pass for it. I was actually in shock. A few weeks later, we were at the mall and he pulled my hair because he said I was looking at some guy. I tried to get up and leave and he wouldn't let me. Part 3 of how I exposed my abusive toxic boyfriend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. So at the mall, he pulled my hair back because he thought I was looking at a guy. Then I tried to get up from the table, but he wouldn't let me. That's when he said he was gonna have to control me more from now on, because clearly I was trying to look for other guys. Then he dropped me off at my dorm room and insisted on coming up. I told him I didn't want him to and that we should reconsider the relationship. I told him he needed to cool off and reconsider how he treated me. That's when he started to cry instantly. He started apologizing and told me that I was right. Then he told me that he loved me. We hadn't used that word before. I didn't realize at the time that he was totally manipulating me. And unfortunately, I decided to give him another chance. A few days later, he asked me why I didn't tell him I loved him back. I told him I just wasn't sure. Then he started yelling at me, telling me that there were so many girls ready for him to be single, and that he had a girl text him every single night, but he would say no just because of me. So I told him I loved him. After that, he was a lot nicer. Until one night, he slapped me. Part 4 of how I exposed my abusive toxic boyfriend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. One night, he took me out to dinner and started asking me all these weird questions. He wanted to know about my last ex and why we broke up, and when I didn't give him enough information, he got really angry. When we got in his car, he slapped me and told me that I was a liar. After that, he just got worse. He would randomly just push me up against a wall if I annoyed him. He would constantly take my cell phone and start checking it. He even made me give him the password to my email. I decided that I was going to start recording all the abuse. I started recording all of our conversations and even set up a camera in my room. And of course, I had all this proof. One day I finally told him I didn't want to be with him anymore and he threatened me. I also told him that I was going to go to the police. Then he told me I would never be able to leave him and that no one would believe me because he never left bruises. That's when he started stalking me. He would also show up at my apartment and try to force his way in. He would grab me and try to kiss me and I would just push him away. So I finally went to the police. And I also went to the head of the school. I finally got a restraining order and the school expelled him. If you've experienced any of this, please get out of your relationship. Don't make my mistake.